Hello and welcome back to the EduPulse podcast. In this episode, Adam and Chris discuss all things retrieval practice. Why not get involved in the conversation and join us over on Twitter at EduPulseCo. Welcome back, everybody. And Adam, a big welcome back to you, because the last time we saw you, you were on a train somewhere.
I was. I don't know where I ended up in the end, but I managed to get back eventually. That was an absolute nightmare of a day.
Well, I did tell you that it's your fault for living in.
Absolutely. No, that's just London transport for you, though, isn't it? You think in London that everywhere is like really close together, but like nothing in London is less than like 40 minutes away from anywhere else in London, and you just forget that until you start traveling
it's
around
a huge
and you realise
shock.
it, and it's too late.
My brother lives in London, and I said, "Oh, come and meet me in this place," and he was like, "That'll take me 2 hours." And I'm like, "Oh," because I'm such a West Midlander, you see. But yeah, so obviously last time we were chatting to David Didal, which was a hugely exciting episode and our first in conversation with. But today we're coming back to our roots. We're back for episode 3 for our ICT and ECT colleagues, and this week for a nice short, sharp, snappy episode, it's retrieval practice. So let's just get straight in there, because there is a lot of theory. There's a lot of people out there who talk about retrieval practice, and I'm sure people listening to this will have heard of it. But from our point of view, from your point of view, what is it and why is it so important?
It's not. I think that's the thing, right? So it's huge. Like, it's an absolutely massive thing. And like what actually qualifies as retrieval practice is pretty vast. But I think like the key thing is like trying to narrow it down to like what retrieval practice is the right retrieval practice to be using at a particular point in a lesson or in a sequence for the purpose that you're trying to fulfill, I guess. I think that another thing that's really important for people to understand is that retrieval practice is like one tiny little bit of like a really complex puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And like Kate Jones does this lovely little thing in one of her books where she has retrieval practice as like a puzzle piece, but there's loads of other little puzzle pieces as well, and it just gets the message across really clearly that like retrieval practice is one part of the puzzle and it's all got to kind of lock and fit in together. But essentially, I guess, like if we wanted a working definition for the purposes of our conversation, retrieval practice is ultimately the act of getting information out of the head, or out of the long-term memory, I should say. So that was something that Pooja Agarwal has said before, that it is the act of getting information out. So you've done the teaching bit, it's been encoded into long-term memory, and then retrieval practice is the act of taking it from long-term memory and putting it back into working memory. And there's loads of different reasons why you might do that. The most common one is probably going to be because you want them to use that piece of information in the lesson that's to come. But yeah, retrieval practice in itself is about pulling that information from long-term memory back into working memory.
And I suppose a load of people use retrieval practice all the time, whether they know it or not. You know, it's something that's not everybody would call retrieval practice. You might see teachers saying, "What did we do last week?" That's a really weak example of retrieval practice, but it is a key moment, isn't it, where you challenge your students to be thinking about the last time they accessed this piece of knowledge or this piece of information. And as we kind of said in our first episodes, when we were referring to Ajubel and his connected moments and meaningful links, you can't learn anything new if you aren't linking it back to something that you have previously learned. And as teachers, it's our job to make that learning visible again by dragging it out of the forgetting pit, as it were, and just kind of going, giving it a really good shake, giving it a really good dust down and going, that's the bit that we need. And obviously I think we spoke about last time as well that some of the most important retrieval practice occurs at the moment of forgetting forever. And that's always
that's it.
Key.
I think basically what it comes back to is like this is all underpinned by like what we know about working memory, right? So when you learn something in the first place, if working memory wasn't really limited, you kind of wouldn't need retrieval practice because it would always be there. But working memory is like massively limited. So what ends up happening is the brain goes, well, we can't keep all of this stuff here in this working memory bit, so we're going to have to transfer it somewhere else to like this much better storage place, which is long-term memory, right? So storage strength in long-term memory is generally pretty high. or storage capacity, I should say, sorry, in long-term memory is pretty high. It's almost unlimited. Like there's there's not a study that kind of proves that beyond doubt, but there are no kind of proven limits to it at this stage. But working memory is super limited. So, you can't store it all in working memory. So it has to go into long-term memory, which then means that if you want it, you're going to have to retrieve it. So that's therefore where you kind of get this idea of retrieval practice from. And yeah, what you were talking about there is that idea of like, right, okay, I need to link this new piece of information to something they already know. So something I'm going to do is I'm going to activate some prior knowledge. So people might have heard that phrase used before, activation of
Yeah.
prior knowledge. And you can use retrieval practice to activate that prior knowledge so that it's really, really clear to the pupils that you're teaching how it is that you want to link what you're about to teach them to something that they already know. But again, that's one way that you can use it, and with your example, you'd use that at the start of a lesson to bring into the forefront of their minds the thing that you want them to link the new information to.
Well, and of course, I'm doing a load of retrieval practice at the moment because at my school it's GCSE season. So every morning
Yes.
before their exams, they're turning up at 8 a.m. for a bit of a breakfast club. Not that there's much eating going on because they're so nervous, but there's some really key things I'm taking advantage of in terms of the memory. We've done some revision practice. We've learned how to revise by talking about some of the things that you've alluded to in terms of working memory and how they learn. Really important to teach them that element of metacognition. And I know we've got an episode in the future coming up about that. But for me, it links back to that fundamental notion of retrieval practice, because before they go in, today was their English literature exam, paper 2. And so I reminded them about their 3 key assessment objectives, some key pieces of language that they would need to use, and did some very basic retrieval practice so that it was back in their working memory, which, as you said, is so limited. So that's like a real world application. What are the other things that kind of retrieval practice needs to be combined with to make it useful, I guess?
I think the short answer to that is everything. So retrieval practice should
Yeah.
be combined with like really, really high quality explanation and high quality modeling. But I think the key considerations that you've got when you're trying to use retrieval practice would probably be like one of them would definitely be spacing. So
Yeah.
you touched on earlier around the importance of retrieving something just as it's about to be forgotten. So that comes back to the idea that when you have to think hard to retrieve a piece of knowledge, it makes it easier for you to retrieve that same piece of knowledge next time.
Yeah.
So what that tells you is that you want to allow enough forgetting to take place for it to be almost completely gone, but not quite. And there's loads of really interesting research around that now, but there's also some much older research which is equally as interesting to read. So you've got like Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, which goes back to like 1885. So that's where like people, even as far back as that, were starting to think about this idea of forgetting. But I think by combining spacing with retrieval, so thinking really hard about, right, how much space do I want to leave before I ask them to retrieve that next time, what you're doing is tapping into the fact that retrieval is you're using retrieval as a learning process rather than an assessment process. So it's not so much you're not kind of giving them a tick for, yes, you managed to get the answer right, you could remember it. So it's not an assessment strategy in that way. It's a learning strategy. So the gains that you get from it aren't from assessment. The gains you get from it are from the act of retrieving from long-term memory back into working memory, because that's what strengthens that knowledge for next time. And so I suppose those two things together. So spacing, really, really important. Have you left enough space between when you taught it and when you're asking them to retrieve it, because you want to maximize that the role that forgetting can play in that. And then the second thing would be really understand that it's a learning strategy, so it's something that's going to strengthen their understanding of that piece of knowledge, not an assessment strategy.
Yeah, and of course, in some of the conversations we've had leading up to this, that's kind of underpinned by what Robert Bjork says, that information becomes more accessible the more it is retrieved. So you improve the retrieval strength by retrieving it. It's the evidence-based version of the more you know, isn't it, really?
The more you know, the more you know. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just there.
To put it
It's a
simply,
self-evident. It's a self-evident thing. Um, let's chat about mistakes. I know one of the things you're really keen on pointing out to people is, lethal mutations, and certainly this isn't a topic that is immune from that. And one of the mistakes you were going to point out is something that I pointed out right at the beginning, which is just using retrieval practice at the start of the lesson. So can you talk me through why just using it there isn't a great use of this low risk strategy?
Well, I think like in a lot of ways, usually it is a great use of it, right? So using retrieval practice at the start of a lesson, if you're using it to retrieve knowledge that you're going to need for the lesson you're about to teach, that is good use of retrieval practice. I
Yeah,
guess the way we should put it, I suppose, is that if you're only using it in that way, then you're not maximizing it at all.
yeah,
So retrieval practice should be taking place throughout the lesson all the time. Every time there's an opportunity to link something back to what you previously taught, use retrieval practice to do it, because rather than you making that link to the pupils and saying, this links to what we did before because this, if you pose that simply just by posing it as a question, as a retrieval activity, you're going to get a gain in terms of their effort retrieving it from long-term memory to working memory. That's then going to strengthen that knowledge for next time, which is always going to be better than just telling it to them. So yeah, if you want to make links between prior learning and learning that you're doing in that lesson, if you want to do that throughout a lesson, then retrieval practice is a great way of doing that. If you were going to transition from one part of a lesson, like one activity or one concept, into another, then again, retrieval practice in the middle of the lesson would be great. You could also use it at the end to like recall knowledge from that lesson. But then I think if you were doing that, although you are asking them to retrieve something that they've been taught, that's probably more consolidation rather than retrieval, probably just because there's not enough forgetting has happened. So,
yeah.
if I taught something in a lesson and then I retrieve it straight away at the end, like with an exit ticket or something, yeah, it's probably more consolidation, I would say, because I've only just taught it to them. Whereas retrieval practice does need to have some kind of forgetting to have taken place for it to be retrieval practice, and for you to get the gains that you'll get from working hard, from making the children work hard to retrieve it.
Well, let's just do something. I'm going to put you on the spot here, a genuine putting you on the spot, a little challenge. I was writing a case
Yeah.
study for potentially for a new book regarding the teaching of English, and I was looking at the way that I teach really complex English ideas, and that I call it diamond thinking, and then break it down into triangles, pyramids that are then broken down into triangles, and how could I use retrieval practice to really ensure that the triangles are pieced together in the right way to create the pyramids that are then pieced together in the right way to create diamonds? What could retrieval practice bring to that kind of curriculum structure that I'm trying to think of if I'm teaching something that's really complex in English?
So what's the idea? So you start off with like the shape that's got the most number of sides, because there's the
Yes.
most number of connections that come from that.
Yeah.
Is
So
that the
that's
idea?
where I start as a curriculum design. I start with the most complex shape, but in order to teach it, I break it down into a less
Yeah.
complex shape, and then the actual teaching begins at the most simplistic of shapes. And it's about bringing them together, building them together, so that we all create more complex shapes together. So that by the end, not only do we have the higher level concept, if you like, that's multifaceted, it's made up of these really accessible pieces that they can break down and refer to later on.
Yeah, love that. Yeah. Like that almost seems like, what's the phrase? So the phrase is like, you sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees.
Mm.
I guess this would be like, you can't see sometimes you can't see the trees for the wood. Maybe, I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if that
Okay.
works at
Yeah.
all. But like what I'm thinking is that you would, I guess, as you're working your way through a unit of work, right? You're dealing with all these little components. Little sound that makes it sound really like downplays it. That's not what I mean. But like you've got all of these components of this bigger theme that you're trying to cultivate an understanding of, and as you go through, you have these episodes of focus on each of these
Hmm.
components, and each time you're trying to show the pupils how each of these components contributes to the bigger whole. And so
Yeah.
over time, they get to see how these components build up into one big composite piece. Is that what you're
It
getting
is,
at?
yeah. So, yeah, I'm guessing, can retrieval practice help in the sense of, would it be good practice to say, here's this really complex pyramid of knowledge we've built together. Let's remind ourselves of the pieces that have made it, or is that undoing it too much? Do we rely on the fact that if the pyramid's built, let's move on? Is there? I guess what I'm asking is, through this worked example, is, can retrieval practice go too far, that you go too far back to the beginning, back to the basics? That might not be necessary
Yeah, I mean,
if
that's
we've covered it.
it's a really, really good question, because I think, and I suppose there's two sides to it. The short answer is I don't know, because like in my mind, I'm thinking, on the one hand, yeah, actually what you want is, as you're moving through that unit of work and you're adding more and more components to this big piece of knowledge that you're developing and building together, you do want to keep on referring back and retrieving what those components were. Because what you don't want to do is get to the end and then go, yeah, okay, we've got the pyramid, right? But actually we've forgotten what all of the bits of the pyramid are, because what
Yeah.
that probably means is that unless we're using the pyramid in this instance, unless we're using the pyramid all the time, eventually when we want to use it, it's probably going to be quite unstable, because we don't have a solid working knowledge of what all of those components are. So on the one hand, yeah, definitely, I would say all the way through that unit, you want to be retrieving all of those components that you've used to that point, or certainly the most important components that you've used to that point. And then, but then on the other hand, yeah, you're right. You want to be careful that once you've got that whole, that you don't continually reduce the whole down to its parts, because I guess you
Mhm.
could then affect like the fluidity and fluency of a pupil's understanding by doing that.
It's interesting, isn't
It's a
it?
really, really interesting question, though.
This is what
Think
I
of
mean,
like
because,
an example of that.
well, yeah, well, no, while you're thinking of that
Like, how
example,
would
I
you?
think it's really interesting that we it could go too far the other way. And I guess one thing I'm keen to do, and loyal listeners will remember us talking about hinge questions, and maybe that's part of this puzzle, is that once you've identified the right moment to ask that hinge question, you don't go backwards. You've passed that threshold. There's no need to over egg the pudding. We're mixing metaphors here. There's no need to go back to those triangle pieces, because they're now fully
Yeah,
assimilated into these pyramids, which in turn have become the new triangles, haven't they? They've become the new constituent pieces they're going to build together to create our multifaceted, complex diamond concept.
yeah, totally. And I think, like, okay, so I'll give you two examples of that, right? Where I think
Yep.
that both of those things can be true. So if you have like a child in reception, so I know like your wife's a reception teacher and an
Yep.
early years lead, right? So she'll be able to tell you all about this. But when children first in reception first learn to write the letter H, right? If you watch a reception teacher teaching that explicitly, they are teaching 3 lines, right? Capital H. So you're going, right, I want one line here. It's a nice long line that finishes on the line, on the line of the page. Then we have another side to the letter that finishes on the line here, and then this line that goes across, right? So those children are learning the 3 component parts of forming that letter, like the 3 lines. Well, at some stage, they chunk that together and learn that that is the letter H. Well, in that
Mm.
instance, it wouldn't make any sense to kind of use retrieval practice to go back and go, but do you remember it's those 3 lines that add together to make
Yes.
that letter? Like, there would be no use in that, because I guess the composite piece of knowledge that you've constructed there, i.e. the letter H, is more useful to you than any of the components themselves. But then on the flip side of that, I suppose, if you were teaching a like a year 9 English set, and you were teaching them to write a critical essay or a reflective essay, you would teach them each of those components to the essay, right? And you'll be able to speak to this more because you're a secondary English teacher. But I guess what you're doing is you're teaching them each of those components, and each time you teach them a component, you then teach them how it applies and show them how to apply that to all of the other components you taught them to that point. And then eventually you build up to the point where they're like, yeah, you can write an essay now, like you're ready to write the essay. But then I'm guessing that the next time you come to write an essay, you don't just go, well, you know how to write an essay now, go. right? At
No.
that point, you
Yeah.
probably would then use retrieval practice to go back to each of those essay writing components. What do you reckon?
Yeah, bang on. Absolutely correct. One of the things that I think is key here to go back to our previous conversation is that for our colleagues out there who are looking to go into secondary, particularly, they're going to be aware of the time constraints that we all have to get the curriculum in to the lessons we have. In episode 2, where we spoke in conversation with David Didow, there was talk about that. We were talking about the fact that there isn't a lot of time, and therefore, what bits of meaningful learning do we lose? What bits of the knowledge-rich curriculum do we lose in order to just hammer the curriculum home? And how awful that was for some teachers and some settings and contexts. One of the things that you will hear as a new teacher going into schools is from more experienced teachers, we don't have time. We don't have time for that. Here's all the things you've got to teach.
Mm.
Get going. What's our kind of firm line to ask a rhetorical question on if somebody says we don't have time to do retrieval practice?
You got to make time. It's as simple as that, because don't forget, I think, again, this is where some teachers and schools, I guess, can see retrieval practice as an assessment opportunity, right? So something you hear, or I've heard a fair bit anyway, is, when I started trying to do like low stakes quizzing within my lessons, I'd
Yeah.
get replies back from other teachers and actually from some leaders in schools that I was in, that, oh, you don't make a pig fatter by weighing it. It's like, yeah, that is true, but I'm not using this as an assessment strategy. I'm using it as a learning strategy, right? Because
Mm.
again, just to keep on hammering that point, if you're using retrieval practice, it is to practice retrieving from long-term memory into working memory. Because you want to use that information, you want it in working memory for what you're about to do with it. But B, because you're strengthening your ability to go and get that information again really, really quickly and naturally next time. So yeah, I mean, in terms of we don't have time, you just have to absolutely make time. Now, I think there's 2 ways that you can do that. You can kind of build it into your questioning routines. So if you are transitioning from one concept into another in a particular lesson, or transitioning from one part of a lesson into another, then thinking really carefully about what are those component bits of knowledge that they're going to need in this next bit. I'm going to tie those bits into my questioning at the start of that little chunk of learning. When I transition into that second stage of the lesson, I'm going to start that second stage with a little bit of questioning around those particular components, so that I'm doing that they're doing that retrieval practice, but they're doing it naturally as part of the questions that I'm asking. It doesn't always have to be kind of, here's 5 retrieval questions on the board, off you go. But I do think that having those opportunities to answer retrieval questions from a board or from a piece of paper are valuable enough to have in there. And I think that in terms of time, to making time for that kind of thing. So, let's say you want to start a lesson with like 5 retrieval practice questions of things that you're going to need in that lesson, knowledge that you're going to need in the lesson that you're about to teach. And someone says, oh, we don't have time for that. I would start looking at things like the tasks that are going to take place. So like what you don't want. And this was actually one, my wife actually she's an HLTA. So she was covering a class the other day, and it was a science lesson. It was all about shadows and light. And she said, like, the lesson was like 25 minutes of cutting out puppets. Like, and you needed the puppets to make the shadows, but that lesson ended up being about cutting out puppets neatly, and nothing to do with the knowledge of light and shadow and how shadow works. So quite often, if you feel like, oh, we don't have enough time for retrieval practice, look at the tasks that you've got set up and think, right, is there any way that we can change that and really refine it to make sure that when they are doing tasks, they're thinking about the thing I want them to think about. And actually, by trimming that task down in that way, does that free up a bit of time for retrieval practice? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I completely agree. You've just sparked a thought in my mind that I knew and realised, but then when somebody else says it out loud, you double down on yourself. I think it's important out there, particularly for our ITT and ECT colleagues, to remember that questioning and retrieval practice is different. And it sounds so obvious, when it's said aloud, one of my first ever teaching jobs, I worked for a performing arts consortium, as a, local authorities having the performing arts, the peripatetic teachers. And I taught a class called Family Learning. And it was an early years craft activity, singing, music hour, as it were. And what the activities involved was me playing with the babies, essentially, and the kind of the toddlers, teaching them how to bang a drum or play a xylophone, and then turn that into a bit of themed crafting. And what the parents didn't realize is that I was actually teaching them. I was modeling good play, exploration of all these things, and that they just didn't realize. They're having a lovely time. I'm here with my child, but actually they were learning from me. That was the intention. And I think sometimes we can make that mistake ourselves in our classroom and start assessing through retrieval practice when we're not here in the moment of retrieval practice to be using what they're remembering necessarily. It's that revision technique, to kind of put it into another term, isn't it? It's that the moment of, now we are going to practice remembering. We're going to be practicing learning, and this is an essential part of it. So to kind of preview a metacognition episode that will come, but the whole learning about learning is so important. And for me, in my setting, I let my young people know we're going to do some retrieval practice now. I don't hide it. I let them know it's what we're doing. I build up to it, but now we're going to remember something we've nearly forgotten. I don't have time to cloud it in mystery. And here's a subtle difference between questioning and retrieval practice. And a bit like how you would prepare a class for cold calling, now we're going to do some retrieval practice. And here's a very, very clear question. I'm going to give you 10 seconds of silence. Let's go. So they're aware that they are going to be remembering something they've nearly forgotten. There might be people out there going, "No, you've undone it. You've undone the purpose." But my setting's quite specific, so I quite like that communication, that honesty with them. Plus, it also helps me remember that I need to do it and that it's different from an assessment point, because it becomes too easy to use that as a Doug Lemov clipboard moment and go, "These kids know something and these don't," you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you made a number of really good points there. Like the I think the biggest one is around agency, right? So you have in your setting, in your classroom, if you want to tell kids, right, we're going to do some retrieval practice now, if you've got a rationale for that and you know that that's the right reason, that's the right thing to do, absolutely go for it. And
Yeah.
I don't think anybody should be there saying to you, that's bad retrieval practice then. Like, I remember I used to have in one school that I worked at, we had a senior leader who had read John Hattie's Visible Learning study and had basically memorized all of the different effect sizes. So for anyone that doesn't know, it's basically the idea
wow.
that certain strategies have got an average effect size of, I don't know, 1.4. And he would literally come round and put a post-it note on your desk after he'd come into your lesson and gone and would write retrieval practice, effect size 1.4, as if every single piece of retrieval practice has an effect size of 1.4, which is obviously crazy, because you can do retrieval practice that's amazing and has a is super effective, or you can do it really badly and it have a negative effect. So the idea being there that the point that I'm trying to make, I guess, is that a lot of the thing that makes the difference about how effective it is the context in which it's being used, and how well you've matched the context that you're trying to use the retrieval practice in with the way that you've used retrieval practice. So again, in your setting, that I know a little bit about your setting, and that matches really, really well with what your setting would demand, right? It might not work in every setting, but that's okay too, and that's where that agency is really, really important. I think the other point you make there as well is that you can do retrieval practice really, really deliberately and really overtly. And like you say, we're now going to do 5 retrieval questions. We're going to be retrieving knowledge from a day ago, 3 days ago, 7 days ago, and 3 weeks ago. Or you can just ask a question as part of your teaching exchange with your pupils that requires them to think back and retrieve information that they've got in their long-term memory and move it into working memory. That's also retrieval practice. So it means a lot of different things. And I think the key thing to take away from it is that, well, the key things I guess that we've covered so far is that retrieval practice doesn't have to be one thing. It can be lots of different things. That you need to make sure that you make time for retrieval practice. So whether it is that sort of formal retrieval practice at the start of a lesson or midway through, or whether it is just that sort of sporadic questioning that you're doing that's requiring pupils to retrieve information from long-term memory, you've got to make time to do it in either of those forms. The other thing I think you've got to make sure as well is it's not high stakes. So what you don't want to do is go, right, we're doing retrieval practice now, guys. This really counts. And I'm going to just give you your scores at the end. And I'm going to write those scores down on the board. And we're going to see how much you've improved next time. Like, that's not the way to use retrieval practice, because that puts the emphasis on the outcome, whereas what you want is the emphasis on the process of retrieving from long-term memory into working memory, right?
That's why I gave the example of the family learning, because the process was the important thing, not the outcome. It was important that the parents and the families were learning how to play with their children. It wasn't the piece of craft that we made at the end. That had almost nothing to do with it. It was just a nice way to package it. So when we look at retrieval practice, as you've just said, low stakes, and we look at how you manage misconceptions, maybe, because that can be one of the mistakes kind of that we've highlighted, is that if you don't give feedback and you don't, no, it's not an assessment point, but if you don't manage misconceptions, all you're going to do is reinforce them in a memory technique, which is the worst thing you could possibly do.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think one of the biggest mistakes people can make with retrieval practice is that they don't give feedback after it. So, let's say you've done a retrieval quiz at the start of a lesson and you've given 5 questions and pupils have answered them, and I don't know, 13 children in your class get question 3 wrong. Well, it doesn't make any sense to move past that and just allow that to be wrong. Although we're saying, the process of trying to remember is the thing that you get the benefit from. You only get that benefit if the thing that they're remembering is correct and is accurate, right? So it's really important to give feedback after retrieval practice as well. And that's the point at which, you go back and you maybe do a little bit of remodeling or a little bit of reteaching on whatever that misconception is that you've seen from that retrieval practice. But again, that's not confusing it with assessment of learning. You're not doing that because you want to know how much they know. You're doing it actually in some ways because you want to know what they don't know. Like, that's the really, really interesting and exciting bit. Like, you want to know what is it that they don't know, because that tells me something that I can reteach and I'm going to get, a real gain from, because they don't know it yet. So it's super, super important after you've done any retrieval practice to make sure that you do feedback after that as well, especially where there's something where you've got a misconception.
Of course. From a devil's advocate point of view, have you ever met a really experienced teacher who can, in one fell swoop, assess and do retrieval practice within the same period of time? Is that possible, or are we standing here saying you shouldn't be doing that? Or are there people out there who eventually can assess and do retrieval practice, do it all in one go?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by assess. I think like if you're saying, assessment, if you're doing retrieval practice, then by definition, I guess I would say what you're doing is assessment. I would say you're doing assessment as learning there. So you are going to get information about what that child knows and remembers, right? So you can class that as assessment. Now, the process of them remembering what they know or what they don't know, trying to remember it, that process leads to better learning, right? Because you're strengthening the retrieval, you're strengthening your ability to retrieve that information more naturally and quickly next time. So I would say that is a form of assessment. It is assessment as learning. You could also use it as assessment for learning, and that's where you have the feedback bit coming in, right? So, I've given this retrieval quiz and I've seen that 13 children have got question 3 wrong, and so therefore that's telling me something about what they don't understand, or that's telling me something about a misconception. So I can now plug that misconception by reteaching that. So there you go. You've got an example of it being used as assessment for learning. I think using retrieval practice as a form of assessment of learning, I guess, I mean, if you were to think about if you've taught the entire GCSE English syllabus and they go and sit a GCSE, I guess what they're doing there is retrieval practice, right? They're remembering everything that they've learned. It's just that the focus isn't on the act of retrieval. The focus is on the outcome of the test and on the
Yeah,
summative
of
judgment.
course.
And I think when you shift that focus onto the summative judgment, then I think that you're likely to get fewer gains from it as a retrieval activity than what you would do if it was lower stakes. You've got to, I think that's the a real key message. If you want pupils to really focus on the gains that they get from the process of thinking hard and trying to remember, you got to keep the stakes low. And I don't think you can keep the stakes particularly low if you're trying to marry it with a high stakes assessment.
Yeah. I think one of the important things when I did my GCSEs, they were, particularly the sciences, were modular, multiple
Yeah, yeah.
choice, and kind of a linear long-term retrieval was never really necessary, because once a unit of work was done, it was done. And you would then only have to maybe revise some very specific topics for an end of year exam, but you built up your final GCSE as you went along. Now, when you're looking at GCSEs and A levels, for some people it's a 2-year wait, isn't it? Of getting all this information, gathering it together, and maybe it's just the case that for us right now, retrieval practice is the best method we can be using in a classroom to best prepare our young people for the assessment they will eventually be getting by the time they reach me, I guess, from you in primary, beginning that method to when they get to me. Because today my students had to go in with the knowledge of 2 novels. One student was going in with A Christmas Carol and Pride and Prejudice. That's a lot of words and information and concepts and quotes and characters and plot to keep in your head, and therefore the ability to retrieve really quite quickly important information that's in the question. Please answer this question about family, and then you get given an extract, and then you've got to think about myriad things that link to it. And I guess that might be why retrieval practice is one of the first things we've come to in the podcast, because of how important it is. As we kind of wrap up, because we said we want to keep these, we could talk about this for hours, I know, and we want to keep these nice and bite-sized so that it can be done in one bus journey on the way to university or on the way to work. Is there anything that you kind of think that we haven't said about retrieval practice that is really important?
No, I think like probably one other thing that springs to mind is like the importance of scaffolding it as well, because like you have like free retrieval where you can do things like people might have heard of strategies like blurting, where you just write down everything you know about a particular topic, which is
Brain dump.
great. But brain dump, yeah, exactly. Now what you can end up with that, I think there's 2 things that can go wrong with that. I think you either get students who potentially, I mean, some students would be absolutely fine with that, but some students would go, well, I don't remember anything, or I'm not sure what it is you want me to remember, therefore I'm kind of a bit reluctant to commit anything to paper. Then you'll get the others who are like, I don't know, like let's say that you've taught them about, I don't know, like A Christmas Carol. That was one that you just mentioned a second ago, right? So let's say you've taught them about A Christmas Carol, and you go, okay, I want you to write down everything that you remember about A Christmas Carol, and you want them to be writing down things about like, the morals of the story, and you want them to be writing down things about like society at the time, and they write down Scrooge had a beard, or I don't know if he did have a beard, but Scrooge had a beard, or it was written in 18 whenever it was, or so they're writing stuff down that's kind of surface level and superficial. So to kind of scaffold that, what you could do is write down everything you know about, or everything you remember, about A Christmas Carol under these 3 headings, and then you give them I don't know, what are the three big themes from A Christmas Carol?
Let's go right off the bat. We could go the transformation of Scrooge's attitude towards Christmas, poverty, and the treatment of
Yeah,
children.
cool. So attitudes towards Christmas, right? So even if you just started with that, you go, okay, right, then everything you remember about A Christmas Carol under the heading attitudes to do with Christmas. And then immediately that kid that's going, oh, I'm not really sure what you want me to remember. They're like, oh, okay, you want me to remember that. And the kid that's about to write down that Scrooge was fat, he's all of a sudden he's going to go, oh no, okay, that's irrelevant. You want me to write down stuff like this, right? So you kind of guide their thinking. You give them a bit of a prompt their thinking to start with. So that's something that you can do that's really really useful, just to kind of scaffold the retrieval that you are asking them to do. Other things you can do, like give them a sentence starter, like a sentence stem, especially if you're using retrieval practice and you want to do it in pairs. Like definitely, I would say give them a sentence stem so that you start them off talking and thinking about the thing you want them to talk and think about. You can also give them like pictures or icons that represent the things that you want them to remember. So again, if let's use a different one, like geography. So if you're teaching geography and you're teaching about coastlines, and you want them to remember things like to do with erosion and deposition and that kind of stuff, you would put icons down the side of the page. Go, okay, write down everything you remember about this topic, but next to these icons, and they've got to look at that icon and go, oh yeah, so that reminds me of, and then they write down everything that they remember based on that. So scaffolding retrieval practice is a really, really important thing to do. However, as with all scaffolds, you do eventually want to move to the point where you can kind of remove those scaffolds, and free retrieval is the ultimate. That's kind of like the holy grail. But yeah, don't feel afraid of like scaffolding it in the meantime until you get there.
Well, it's so important, isn't it? As you were talking, then I was just imagining the Disney's Aladdin. And so bear with me here a second. So when he's like go into the cave of wonder and grab this very specific thing. Well, he was successful in that because that he didn't say go in the cave and I'll see you later. Talk to me about the cave, because he's like, well, it was dark and there was a lot of things in there. If we've got this cave of wonder, this amazing long-term memory that's full of all of these treasures. See, I told you this would work. So all of these treasures and beautiful jewels and things, some of them are not going to be needed in that moment of assessment. Some of them are not going to be needed in that moment of retrieval. But there's this one thing. I want you to find everything that's round. And so you're training your brain to find those round objects and to gather them and bring them back into the working memory of Aladdin's desert. I think I've run out. I think that metaphor's run its course.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I think it's a really good one. Even going back to that example you gave earlier with the diamonds and the triangles and stuff, like that in itself, a retrieval activity around, okay, I'm going to give you all of the knowledge and information that you've learned over the course of this unit of work. Like, see if you can write the connections down yourself. So like, I'm going to give you just the diamond, and then with the thing that's got the most number of connections, see if you can list all of the connections that come off that diamond. And if you can't, turn over one of the triangles, because that will give you a prompt. Okay, yeah, so that triangle goes with that diamond. Right, let me see if I can remember some of the other triangles that might go with that. So there's tons and tons of ways that you can kind of cue the retrieval practice. But yeah, the place that you want to get to eventually is where it is kind of free retrieval. And I think that's kind of where people often go wrong, though, is they'll use those two different types of retrieval practice that we've spoken about, really, which is firstly, like, I would say, like, we're going to call it like formal retrieval, I suppose, where you have a 5-question retrieval quiz at the start of a lesson, and it's going to be on stuff that they're about to use in that lesson, right? So you've got that form of retrieval practice. But then you've also got the form of retrieval practice that is more responsive. So, I'm about to transition from one concept to another within a lesson, and I'm going to ask this question because I know it's going to make them think about the stuff that I want them to be thinking about for the next part of the lesson. So you've got those two types of retrieval practice, I guess, that we've covered tonight. And I think that in both those cases, don't be afraid to scaffold it. and whatever that scaffolding needs to look like to give them the prompting and the cueing to do the thinking that you want them to do, it's worth it, because it's the thinking that's going to give you the learning gains, not the outcome from the. Okay, so yeah, so like we've covered tons and tons in that, but I guess just to like do a bit of a recap. So retrieval practice is like the act of retrieving knowledge or information from long-term memory and pulling it back into working memory. So as Pooja Agarwal says, it's about taking the knowledge out rather than putting it in. So that's kind of was our working definition of retrieval practice. Then we talked about like what it looked like in action, and we looked at two different ways that it might look in action. So one being like a more sort of formalized retrieval practice activity, which might be like a knowledge quiz at the start of a lesson. And we said that with that, like the really key bit is there you want them to be retrieving knowledge that they're then going to go on to use in that lesson. We talked then about another way that you can use retrieval practice, which is more kind of responsive within the lesson. So I'm just about to transition from part 1 of the lesson into part 2. And so I need them to be thinking about this, this, and this. And so I'm going to get them to do some retrieval practice on that. We talked about retrieval practice as well as being like the fact that it's a learning strategy, not an assessment strategy, because it is the act of retrieval that strengthens your ability to go and get that knowledge again next time. And so we talked then about the importance of spacing, so just leaving just enough space for it to be almost forgotten just before you retrieve it, because the harder you have to work to remember that piece of knowledge, the more accessible it will be to you next time round. Then we looked at a couple of like key mistakes that people can make with retrieval. So the first one being just using retrieval at the start of the lesson, so ignoring that kind of more responsive approach to retrieval that you can do throughout the lesson. Then we talked a little bit about like using. We talked about people saying that we don't have time for retrieval, and we just talked about the fact that you've got to make time for it. So 5-10 minutes within a lesson to do some retrieval practice is always going to be time well spent. You're going to get massive payback from that, because it is such a strong activity to do in terms of the learning gains that you get from it. And we talked about maybe looking at some of your tasks to see if there's some time that you can chop off of that and reinvest back into retrieval practice. We said that you've got to keep the stakes really low. So, don't have this kind of high stakes approach to retrieval practice where the focus becomes the outcome of the retrieval rather than the process. It is all about the process. And then the last kind of couple of things that we talked about was the importance of giving feedback. So once you've done some retrieval practice, you've got to make sure that you give feedback on it and plug those misconceptions if the retrieval practice has revealed them. And then the last thing that we looked at was around scaffolding it. So don't be afraid to scaffold retrieval practice by using kind of picture prompts or keyword prompts, but also then be prepared to over time withdraw that scaffolding so that eventually you get to that holy grail of free retrieval. So yeah, that was really good. Really enjoyed chatting that through, and hopefully it's useful. And I'm sure we'll come back to it at some point as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, amazing. Brilliant, succinct recap of everything we've spoken about with retrieval practice. And I look forward to having another chat with you, mate.
Yeah, good stuff. See you soon.
We'll be back soon with more conversations and advice for those of you starting your teaching career, and head-nodding moments with our special guests. As ever, please head over to Twitter and join in the conversation at EduPulse Co, and we'll see you next time.